On the morning of December 6, 1917, a 45-year-old train dispatcher named Vincent Coleman kissed his wife and children goodbye and walked to work. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, he would face a choice that most of us will never have to make. A choice between saving his own life and saving the lives of hundreds of strangers. But we'll get to that moment soon enough. First, you need to understand what Halifax looked like back then. This Canadian port city had become one of the busiest places in North America during World War I. Ships carrying soldiers, weapons, food, and supplies crossed the Atlantic every single day, and Halifax was their last stop before heading into the dangerous waters where German submarines waited. The harbor was always crowded. The docks were always busy. And on that particular Thursday morning, 2 ships were about to cross paths in the worst possible way. The first ship was called the Mont Blanc. She was a French cargo vessel, and what she carried in her hold was terrifying. Over 2,000 tons of explosives, picric acid, TNT, barrels of gasoline stacked on her deck. This ship was basically a floating bomb, and she was heading into one of the busiest harbors on the continent. Now here's the thing that makes this story even more tragic. Because of wartime rules, the Mont Blanc wasn't allowed to fly a red warning flag. The military didn't want German spies to know which ships were carrying dangerous cargo. So she entered the harbor looking like any other vessel, and nobody on shore had any idea what was packed inside her. Coming from the opposite direction was a Norwegian ship called the Imo. She was on her way to New York to pick up relief supplies for Belgium. Her captain had been delayed the day before and was in a hurry to make up lost time. Both ships entered the narrow channel that connected the outer harbor to the inner basin. It was barely half a mile wide at that point. And somehow, through a series of whistle signals and course changes that historians still debate today, neither captain would give way to the other. At exactly 8:45 in the morning, the Imo struck the Mont Blanc. The collision happened at a crawl, maybe 1 mile per hour. It barely dented either ship, but that gentle impact was enough to knock over barrels of fuel on the Mont Blanc's deck. Sparks flew, and within seconds, fire erupted. The captain of the Mont Blanc knew exactly what was about to happen. He ordered his crew to abandon ship immediately. They lowered the lifeboats and rowed as fast as they could toward the far shore, screaming warnings in French. But almost nobody understood them. And even if they had, it probably wouldn't have mattered. Because by then, a massive column of black smoke was rising into the morning sky, and everyone in Halifax had stopped to watch. Think about that for a moment. All across the city's north end, people saw that smoke and came outside to get a better look. Workers in the rail yards put down their tools. Mothers stepped onto their porches. Kids pressed their faces against classroom windows. Sailors climbed the masts of their ships for a better view. It was a spectacle, this burning ship drifting toward the pier. Nobody knew what she was carrying. Nobody understood that they were watching a countdown to the worst disaster in Canadian history. Meanwhile, the Mont Blanc floated slowly toward Pier 6, pushed by the current, her flames growing higher by the minute. Firefighters rushed to the scene. One crew positioned their engine next to a hydrant, ready to fight the blaze. They had no idea they were standing at ground zero. And this brings us back to Vincent Coleman. He was working at the Richmond train station that morning, a small wooden building right on the waterfront, maybe 700 feet from where the burning ship was about to dock. When a sailor burst through the door, shouting that the ship was loaded with explosives, Coleman's first instinct was to run. His colleague grabbed him by the arm and told him they had to get out immediately. But Coleman stopped. He remembered something. The overnight express train from St. John was due to arrive in just a few minutes. Nearly 300 passengers were on board, and that train would pass directly in front of the burning ship on its way into the station. His colleague begged him to leave. There was no time. The ship could explode any second. Vincent Coleman sat down at his telegraph machine instead. He began tapping out a message. The words traveled down the wire to the next station, then the next, spreading outward across Nova Scotia at the speed of electricity. The message read, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was going to die. And he stayed at that telegraph key anyway, making sure his warning got through, making sure that train full of passengers would stop before it was too late. At 9:04 in the morning, the Mont Blanc exploded. What happened next is almost impossible to describe. The blast released energy equivalent to nearly 3,000 tons of TNT. It was the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen, and it would hold that record until the atomic bomb. A white-hot fireball vaporized everything within a quarter mile. The shockwave traveled faster than the speed of sound, flattening buildings like they were made of cardboard, snapping iron rails, ripping trees out of the ground by the roots. A wall of water 60 feet high rose up from the harbor and crashed into the city. The IMO was picked up and thrown onto the opposite shore. Pieces of the Mont Blanc, some weighing hundreds of pounds, rained down across an area 5 miles wide. One chunk of her anchor, half a ton of twisted metal, landed more than 2 miles away. The entire North End neighborhood of Richmond simply vanished. The rail yards, the factories, the churches, the schools, the homes where families had eaten breakfast just minutes before. All of it reduced to burning rubble in a single instant. The blast was so powerful that windows shattered 50 miles away. People heard the explosion 200 miles distant. And in the middle of all that destruction, roughly 1,600 people died in the first few seconds. By the time rescuers finished counting, the death toll would reach nearly 2,000. Another 9,000 were injured. And here's a detail that still haunts historians today. Hundreds of people were blinded, many of them women and children, who had been watching that burning ship through their windows. When the explosion hit, the glass became a storm of flying blades. Vincent Coleman's body was found days later in the wreckage of his station. His pocket watch had stopped at the exact moment of the blast. Rescuers recovered his telegraph key and his pen, and they gave these items to his widow. The train he had warned was stopped safely outside the blast zone. Nearly 300 lives saved because one man refused to run when he had every reason to. But the story doesn't end there. Not even close. Because as the smoke cleared and the survivors began to dig through the rubble searching for their families, the sky turned gray, the temperature dropped, and by the next morning, a blizzard was bearing down on Halifax, about to bury the ruined city under 16 inches of snow. The worst was not over. In fact, for the people trapped beneath the debris, for the doctors working by candlelight in damaged hospitals, for the thousands who had just lost everything, the nightmare was only beginning. That's where Part 2 picks up. When the sun rose on December 7th, 1917, the people of Halifax woke up to a nightmare that had somehow gotten worse. The explosion had leveled entire neighborhoods. Nearly 2,000 people were dead. 9,000 more were injured. And now, less than 24 hours later, the sky had turned an ugly gray and the temperature was dropping fast. By noon, a massive blizzard had rolled in from the Atlantic. 16 inches of heavy, wet snow began falling on the smoldering ruins. The wind howled through shattered buildings. And somewhere beneath all that rubble, survivors were still trapped, still calling out for help, their voices growing weaker by the hour. Imagine being a rescue worker that day. You're digging through collapsed houses with your bare hands because there's no heavy equipment. You can hear someone crying for help under the debris, but the snow is piling up so fast you can barely see. Your fingers are numb. Your back is aching. And you know that for every person you pull out alive, there are dozens more you won't reach in time. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Many of them had been damaged by the blast, their windows blown out, their walls cracked. Doctors performed surgeries by candlelight because the power was out across most of the city. Nurses worked without rest, moving from patient to patient, doing whatever they could with whatever supplies remained. The injured kept arriving faster than anyone could treat them. And then there were the dead. So many dead that the city had to set up temporary morgues in schools and churches. Families wandered through rows of bodies, searching for their loved ones, hoping they wouldn't find them there. A system was quickly put in place to identify and catalog the victims, based on methods developed after the Titanic disaster just 5 years earlier. Even with that system, many bodies were never identified. They were buried in mass graves, their names lost to history. Halifax was completely cut off from the outside world. The telegraph lines that had been hastily repaired after the explosion were torn down again by the storm. Roads were impassable. Rail lines were blocked by snow and debris. The city was alone, frozen and desperate. But help was already on the way. Hundreds of miles to the south, in Boston, a single telegraph message had arrived the previous evening. It came from a private business line, one of the few that still worked after the explosion. The message was short and desperate. It said to organize a relief train immediately, to gather every doctor and nurse available, and to bring as many supplies as possible. It warned that the casualty list was enormous. That was all the information Boston had. No details, no explanation. Just a cry for help from a city in ruins. And here's what happened next. Within 12 hours, less than half a day after receiving that message, Massachusetts Governor Samuel McCall had organized one of the fastest disaster responses in American history. A train was loaded with doctors, nurses, medical equipment, food, blankets, and building materials. By 10 o'clock that night, it was heading north toward Halifax, pushing through the same blizzard that was burying the city. The train was delayed by the storm, but it kept going. It arrived on the morning of December 8th, and the medical teams went to work immediately. They set up emergency hospitals in any buildings still standing. They distributed food and water to survivors. They relieved the exhausted local doctors and nurses who had been working without sleep since the explosion. One of the men who arrived on that train was a Boston businessman named Abraham Racheski. He injured his back almost immediately after arriving, but he refused to stop working. For weeks, he coordinated relief efforts across the city, converting buildings into shelters, organizing supply distribution, and helping thousands of displaced families find food and housing. The people of Halifax would later call him a hero. Boston's doctors took on the most difficult cases, especially the eye injuries. Remember all those people who had been watching the burning ship through their windows? When the blast hit, flying glass had blinded hundreds of them, many of them children. A team of eye surgeons worked around the clock, performing operations that would later influence the entire field of ophthalmology. One doctor who came from Boston to treat burn victims would go on to become a pioneer in pediatric surgery, using lessons he learned in Halifax to save countless lives in the decades that followed. The relief effort grew larger by the day. Trains arrived from Montreal, Toronto, and New York. Ships brought supplies from across the Atlantic. But it was Boston's response that Halifax would never forget. The speed of it, the generosity of it, the simple fact that a city 400 miles away had dropped everything to help strangers in their darkest hour. As the weeks passed, Halifax began to dig itself out. The blizzard eventually stopped. The fires were extinguished. The injured were treated. And slowly, painfully, the city started to rebuild. A relief commission was established just 1 week after the explosion. It would remain in operation for nearly 60 years, making it one of the longest-running disaster relief efforts in history. The commission faced an impossible task. Thousands of families had lost everything: homes, businesses, possessions, loved ones. Compensation claims flooded in by the thousands. Temporary housing had to be built immediately. Within 7 weeks, workers were constructing apartments at a rate of 1 per hour. But the commission also saw an opportunity. The neighborhood that had been destroyed, a working-class area called Richmond, had been crowded and poorly planned. Narrow streets, wooden buildings packed close together, no green spaces. The planners who oversaw the reconstruction decided to build something better. They brought in a famous town planner from England who designed a completely new neighborhood. Wide streets lined with trees, gardens in front of every home. And most importantly, the houses were built from a fireproof material called hydrostone, compressed concrete blocks that wouldn't burn like the wooden buildings that had been destroyed. It was one of Canada's first planned communities, a model of modern urban design that still stands today. Of course, not everyone benefited equally from the rebuilding. Some communities were ignored. Some families never received fair compensation. The scars of that day would linger for generations. For decades after the explosion, people in Halifax rarely talked about it. The trauma was too deep. It wasn't until the 1980s that the city truly began to reckon with what had happened. But one tradition began almost immediately, and it continues to this day. In 1918, just 1 year after the disaster, Nova Scotia sent a Christmas tree to the city of Boston. It was a simple gesture of thanks for everything Boston had done. That single tree became an annual tradition. Every year since 1971, Nova Scotia has sent a giant Christmas tree to Boston Common, where it's decorated with thousands of lights and seen by hundreds of thousands of people. Children in Nova Scotia still learn about the Halifax Explosion in school. They learn about the tragedy, yes, but they also learn about Boston's response. They're taught that when their city was at its lowest point, when everything seemed hopeless, help came from across the border. They're taught that Boston was one of the first responders, and really a lifesaver. Every December 6th, just before 9 in the morning, a memorial service is held at Fort Needham Park in Halifax. Bells ring across the city. The names of the dead are read aloud, and people remember. They remember the explosion that killed nearly 2,000 people in a single instant. They remember the blizzard that buried the ruins. They remember the doctors and nurses who worked without rest. They remember the strangers who came from hundreds of miles away to help. And they remember Vincent Coleman, the train dispatcher who could have run but chose to stay. His telegraph key is still on display at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. A harbor ferry now bears his name. His final message, those 11 words tapped out in the face of certain death, is etched into Canadian history. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Some stories deserve to be remembered. This is one of them.